from that side of things, every single team is chasing gains. That's all they're doing. It's all about gains. Arrows, we say we're in the downforce mines. Like you're in the mines and you're chasing gains like downforce. And so you slap something on your car, you see another team doing it, and you're like, this works. Like it works for our car. It brings us gains. Let's use it. I don't care who it's from. It doesn't matter. But if it works, and it works. Credit to Williams. Williams put this really cool little, it's like a bubble in the corner of the diffuser, and now almost every team on the grid has this. And so, it doesn't matter who it is, but if you see something, you try it on your car and it brings you gains, and you're like, hey, let's take this, let's run with it. It's bringing us performance, and I think that's what Red Bull's doing. Car is like an aerodynamic symphony, and any symphony in its sort of micro view is just a collection of notes, and a car is like that. It's an aerodynamic symphony from front to back. It's a bunch of collective aerodynamic features that are working together to give you an overall car that functions and performs as you want it to. What does efficiency mean? It is lift to drag or downforce to drag ratio. If you can get a lot of downforce with little drag penalty, then that's where you want to be. That is an efficient car, and the floors are a very efficient way of generating downforce, way more efficient than front wings, way more efficient than rear wings.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour. With me today, I have a very special guest, an F1/aerodynamic mind like no other. This has been years in the making, it feels like, Dr. Obbs. First time that we're talking face to face virtually, although I feel like I've sat in on many a Twitter space and absorbed all of your aerodynamic knowledge as far as possible. Not much. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Cameron. It's an honor to be on your podcast. You're doing some great things, man. Really enjoy your YouTube channel there. And I think the first time we met was on Twitter Space, and it's good to finally be face to face now. Spend some time talking together. Doing well. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks, Dr. Obbs. I appreciate you asking me. First, let me give you and Molly a massive shout out on the Breaking Bias podcast. Some fantastic work. Again, if you like getting a bit techie and understanding more about all things F1, but particularly with a technical lens on, and particularly furthermore about aero, go and give that podcast a follow out on all good podcasting platforms. Dr. Obbs also has his personal YouTube channel. That is called Dr. Obbs. Go and check him out doing fantastic breakdowns, particularly around this time of year when we get some very cheeky liveries. Or do we, Dr. Obbs? Because I'm looking at some of that stuff and I'm like, particularly the RB20. And is that the real RB20 that Red Bull are going to run for the first race? Or
I think that's a $1 million question there, Cameron. I think generally speaking, most people feel like this is not the car that's going to come to Bahrain. It's the chassis. I can say that probably with some certainty that it's the same chassis, but there's a lot of bits on that car that are kind of a mix between RB19 and maybe some new RB20s. If you had to ask me, I think probably the overbite feature, which is where the side pod really extends out forward and then the intake is below it. I think that's going to stay. I think that is in fact part of the RB20, but I think there's a lot of other features that are maybe due to change it.
Go on then, Dr. Obbs. Talk to me like I am daft, because I am daft as far as these technical things are. You said overbite. What does that even mean, Dr. Obbs?
It's just a cheeky way of us aero nerds trying to classify whether or not the intaker is above or below the extension of the side pod. So I guess the best way to explain it is to start from a neutral concept. So most people are familiar with where you have an intake. It looks like just an ellipse or a hole, and both the upper and the lower bounding surface are even. So if you looked at it in the X direction, which is along the length of the car, it's the same. Now, if the bottom extends out further than the top, it's called an underbite. So just like if your jaw would extend out further than your bottom jaw extends out further than your top jaw, then it's called an underbite. The only difference being in this case, instead of a mouth, it's an intake to a car. So The opposite is true for an overbite. So then in that case, the bounding surface is extended out furthermost on the top portion, and the intake is then below that top portion. So aerodynamically speaking, they're quite different. And there's pros and cons to each, but yeah, Red Bull, I guess that was the most striking change is that they've now flipped it from an underbite concept to an overbite concept.
And are we buying and selling that they're going to carry that forward through to testing at the very least? Because I've seen a couple different plans of that inlet, right? I've seen the people are calling it an S duct, and then they've got Checo Perez taking a selfie where you've got the vertical one. Dr. Obbs, how many inlets do they want into those side pods, and which of those do you think they'll carry through?
I think Ferrari was the first one in last year's car in the SF23 to show the S duct in this regulation set, which was really interesting. So normally what people do is right around what's called the bib. So if you look right underneath the driver where the floor is, there's kind of there's all these things that look like teeth, right? And those are called fences. And in the most inner portion of the fence, so in the very middle is the bib. It's like a big blunt pointy feature in the floor. And right down the middle, there's usually a little slit right there where they bring in air to cool all the electronics. So the driver is literally sitting on top of batteries and electronic control units and CPUs and all kinds of cool techie stuff underneath there. And it gets really hot and needs to be cooled. So they usually use that air. Now, on the flip side, what Ferrari did last year was they created a little S duct or a little slot on the bottom side of their side pod right next to the driver, which is called inboard. On the inboard side, they created this little vertical slit, and that's what they were using to cool the electronics, but then also they were ejecting that air on top of the side pod. So they were kind of doing two things at once. They were cooling something because that's what the regulation set says. You can't purely use an S duct in a sense that you're just using it aerodynamically, but it has to be used for cooling. So that's what Ferrari did. So now with Red Bull presenting a vertical slit in very much kind of a similar spot that Ferrari did, questions have come. Is this the only inlet? Is there going to be an additional inlet that maybe was masked that we can't see? And I think at the end of the day, the answer to that question is nobody really knows because because the fact is that we don't know how much cooling that each car needs, right? So every car has completely different cooling efficiency and things. Some cars need a bit more cooling than others. I think we saw from Ferrari. Ferrari fans don't get mad at me, but we saw from Ferrari a few years back, right? They were pretty much having a weekend barbecue most race weekends when the engines were catching on fire. They needed quite a bit more cooling than others, right? So Red Bull has been pretty good on the cooling side of things, I think. And have they made any progress in sense that, maybe they don't need as much cooling intake now as they did previously? And maybe that single slit that runs up and down is enough. I think that's the question we're all waiting to see in Bahrain.
Wow, Dr. Obbs, this is fascinating, man. I read, and I'm going to botch this massively, but I read that, I suppose under the umbrella term of Red Bull potentially leveraging some of the ideas that were on the Mercedes W14 last year, the zero pod, all that other good stuff, as at Suzuka potentially a course or a circuit where there's less cooling required. I read, Dr. Obbs, and again we can get into that in a second, but I read that the reason why Red Bull are doing that because under the guise of cooling, there is this weird quirk in the rules and regs that they can use more, they have access to more wind tunnel time. Is that right, or am I just talking out my ASS here?
So there's a portion of the regulation set that says that whenever you're doing anything with relation to cooling efficiency and improving, engine reliability related to cooling, then that doesn't necessarily relate to your wind tunnel credits. But at the same time, I think you have to still, you're not allowed to run the same amount of sensors, and you're not allowed to do the same type of measurements that you would do on a regular wind tunnel run. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison. I think that was something that For instance, last year on the RB19, when Red Bull first launched the extreme underbite, and I think that was in Baku, everybody was like, what is happening here? And then the stories all started coming out about how, Red Bull had this wind tunnel penalty, this aerodynamic penalty that was associated with cost cap violation, and that they were using kind of this roundabout way to do it. And it's true that it from a regulation set it doesn't count, but you can't use the same types of sensors, like I said. So it's not really the same thing. You're not getting the same kind of data that you would if you did like a regular wind tunnel run.
Fair play. So are you calling again? I'm focused on RB20 here, Dr. Obbs. You'll excuse me because I want to understand what the market leader is doing, right? But as far as the gun barrels at the upper rearward portion of that RB20, the community is divided. Some people say they're just trolling Mercedes. Some people are saying that they have serious plans to leverage some of the cleverer things that Mercedes were doing last year, and then we again hear that zero pods could come into play as early as Suzuka with their first upgrade. Where do you sit on this? On which side of the fence do you sit on, Dr. Obbs? Would they be? I know that Adrian Newey, the one thing that he isn't is technically arrogant, right? If something's useful, he will bring it in. But that feels almost surreal that they'd be leveraging stuff on a Mercedes design philosophy that ostensibly was a failure.
Yeah, so I see a lot of this kind of circulating around the internet, and I think dramatization and sensationalism on the internet is just kind of like regular occurrence. So it's no surprise to me, honestly, that the media is probably just sort of stoking this fire just for clicks and engagement. From an engineering standpoint, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about motor racing or you're talking about another industry where you're an engineer designing something and there's competition, right? There's competition in every business. And as an engineer, you design something that needs to perform and outperform your competition. And you never do anything in a way that's politically motivated or what would we say, trolling motivated or something, I guess it's like, with this penchant to like make somebody angry or make fun of something that has failed on somebody else. I think that what you always do is you always look at your competition and you always assess what your competition is doing. And full credit to Mercedes in 2022 when the W13 came out and the zero pod was there and the amount of work they had to do to get to that point. I think people want to bury the W13. They probably want to bury the W14 as well and forget it ever existed. But there was a lot of really great innovation and work that went into making that happen from an engineering standpoint. And I have no doubt that every single team on the grid after they saw that started playing and they started looking at their models and saying, what, can we get this to work? Now, on the other hand, something that Adrian Newey and co did, and let's emphasize the and co part or the and team, because it really isn't a one-man show over there. There's a lot of really good people, and I know some of those people and talk to them quite regularly. And it's very important that we do recognize that it is a team designing over there. But generally speaking, Adrian Newey is the voice, he's the face, and he says, look, we needed to get the fundamentals right. And the RB18 really was that. It was kind of the fundamentals. They had the year before, they had quite an extensive championship battle. And he even admitted that they got quite late onto the RB18. And so what they put out there, they were very surprised at how competitive it was, honestly. But I think they said, look, let's get the fundamentals right. The RB19 was an evolution. It was a step, but definitely not a big step, I don't think. And then from there, they've got now 2 years of development work to really understand that car and understand this regulation set. And I feel like my feeling is that they've now looked at all these things that Mercedes did, and not just Mercedes, but all the things that Alpine, by the way, Alpine was the first one to come out with water slides. And people don't talk about that enough, but Alpine had water slides, and I know this because I talked to a couple of people who were in the wind tunnel working on the first Alpine that had water slides, and they called it water slides. I want to call it something different, but they called it water slides. So from that side of things, every single team is chasing gains. That's all they're doing. It's all about gains. Arrows, we say we're in the downforce mines. Like you're in the mines and you're chasing gains like downforce. And so you slap something on your car, you see another team doing it, and you're like, this works. Like it works for our car. It brings us gains. Let's use it. I don't care who it's from. It doesn't matter. But if it works, then it works. And I think Red Bull is doing a bit of that. I think they're finding from their competitors some things that they're working on. For instance, they took in their diffuser, in the corner of their diffuser, they took something from Williams. Credit to Williams. Williams put this really cool little, it's like a bubble in the corner of the diffuser, and now almost every team on the grid has this. And so, it doesn't matter who it is, but if you see something, you try it on your car and it brings you gains, and you're like, hey, let's take this, let's run with it. It's bringing us performance. And I think that's what Red Bull's doing.
Fair play, Dr. Obbs. And that's why you always see Adrian Newey just having a cheeky little look at all the other cars up and down the grid, not dissimilar to how Schumacher used to back in the day, and Seb Vettel, always trying to learn in real time from first-hand evidence on the grid. And I think that's really, really interesting. I was going to say finally on Red Bull before we talk about Mercedes, because I'm curious to get your take. Pull rods and push rods, I have no idea what any of this means, Dr. Obbs. I revised ahead of this catch-up, and I understand that Red Bull have pull rod suspension on the front and then push at the back. I expected the rest of them to see and understand that Red Bull are the apex predator as far as the fundaments of their design philosophy, and nail the suspension and have a nice malleable base upon which they can build all of these louvers and gun barrels at the back. And I expected everybody else to fall into place. I've since had many an F1 mind correct me and say, Cameron, stop placing so much emphasis on pulls and pulls of Ferrari or pulls and pushes of Red Bull. Does this stuff really matter, Dr. Obbs, or is it just the team's ability to optimize for their setup irrespective of pull push or push push?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. It's a team's ability to optimize their full setup. So something I've said on our podcast, on the Breaking Bias podcast before, is that a car is like an aerodynamic symphony, and any symphony in its sort of micro view is just a collection of notes. And the collection of notes, then a single note is a note, and then a note with another note starts to become music. And then you take multiple different types of instruments, strings and horns and all these things, and then you create a symphony. And a car is like that. It's an aerodynamic symphony from front to back. It's a bunch of collective aerodynamic features that are working together to give you an overall car that functions and performs as you want it to. And that's why it's very difficult to take something from one team and just slap it on your car and make it work. It's because it's almost like pulling the first chair violinist from an orchestra and then slapping somebody in and just going, hey, play. It's not going to work like that. I mean, if you want a sports analogy, if you take a midfielder from a football team and then just swap him out, put somebody new in, it's going to take a little bit of time for them to get their feet right. Everybody needs to learn how to work together. The same thing is true about aerodynamic philosophies, aero parts. Those things need to all be optimized and everything to get it all to work together. So yeah, push rods, pull rods. I think there's some generalized thoughts on what some benefits would be. So for instance, with the Red Bull pull rod front suspension, one of the things that you do when you do that is you put most of the suspension elements very low in the car, and that lowers your center of gravity on the front, which can be good. The other thing is that Red Bull has said, for them, the choice was not, less so about mechanical things and forces and every suspension dynamics, but more so about aerodynamics. So they found a gain when they used a pull front for them aerodynamically. Now, a push rear I think to me, in Mercedes, and this will be a good segue when we talk to Mercedes about Mercedes. Mercedes has gone to a push rear, but Red Bull had the push rear before, and one of the benefits of a push rear, and Ferrari still has a pull rear, I think. So that's kind of a unique thing. I thought they would go to a push rear, but the push rear is interesting in that it raises all the suspension elements up high. Now that's bad from a COG, a center of gravity standpoint, because now your weight is higher in the car. But what it does is it opens up space on the bottom of the car for you to be able to do things aerodynamically in the diffuser and everything. So having less things lower in the rear means that you have more space in the rear to do diffuser kicks and all kinds of cool little cheeky things that these arrows do to try to get gains. So I think with the push rear, that's definitely something that, at least in my mind, I've sort of convinced myself of, is that going to the push rear does have some impacts in how the air goes to the top of the diffuser along the suspension elements, but more so raising those suspension features higher allows you to do a bit more aerodynamically at the rear.
Fascinating, bruv. I'm in awe listening to you get super techie about all this stuff that I have no clue about and would struggle to unpick by myself. And this is why, you know what, Dr. Obbs, it's good to have voices like you in the space and that can kind of provide some colour to noddy aerodynamic minds like myself, because otherwise I'm just like, it's Spanglish. I just don't understand. It's like you know what I mean? It's like somebody's talking another language. And I think that speaks to your gift, that you're a translator, in fact. Go on then, let's talk about Mercedes. Oh, mate, well deserved, bruv. All I'm doing here is truth saying, Dr. Obbs. Let's talk about Mercedes then very quickly, because like you said, W13, W14, I really struggled to understand. Everybody makes mistakes, right? Even the great agent who has designed cars that ultimately weren't able to run. 2022, then, I would chalk up that mistake to the game. But the fact that they allowed the deception of George Russell's victory in Barcelona that year to drive them to carry through that design philosophy that they couldn't get to work with a very high, a peaky and narrow, inaccessible performance curve. As a Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton fan, I think I can't forgive them for that, Dr. Obbs. Now, finally, it looks like they've rectified for some of the very low-hanging, obvious ills of that design philosophy. The side pods are more protruding because obviously there's no barge boards and they've got to control the dirty air, etc., etc., with a view to have a stable that the drivers can better predict on turning and at the apex. Dr. Obbs, talk to me about the things around the W15 design philosophy in 2024 that jump off this page at you with your aerodynamic glasses on.
So the W15 for me is a really interesting car, because we have seen, like you said, Cameron, the progression from kind of the W13 to the W14 to the W15. I mean, they had, they still had some side pods there, even though we called it the zero pod or whatever, but there was something there. But then kind of graduating from that to the W14 and then the W14B, which for me was kind of a, more of a step towards a conventional kind of side pod car. And then now the W15, I think, is kind of that full spectrum growth of going from sort of this minimal side pod to now accepting that, hey, the downwashing side pod is kind of, the thing that's been working, that seems to be the most stable for everyone. This is also, by the way, just stepping back to the RB20 for just a second, why I don't believe that the RB20 is going to go to a no pod, because I have a lot of just doubts about that design and whether or not it's able to generate enough forward pressurization on the floor to be able to have some forward balance, which I think was part of the reason why the W13 and W14 were, W14B maybe not as much, but definitely W13 was so peaky. But there's it's never as simple as we try and make it out to be, or we discuss it. I mean, even my understanding is just so minuscule compared to the complexity of these cars. There's interactions between aerodynamics and suspension dynamics, and all these things. And, yaw, roll, pitch, heave, all these different sort of degrees of freedom of motion that you have are affecting everything. And it's not a constant stable platform. It is constantly changing during a race. And so let's talk about the W15. So what I see in the W15 that I think is really cool is they have a P-shaped inlet. So this is very kind of similar to what we saw with the Alpine. And that means that in the same vein that the Red Bull has this sort of vertical inlet along the inboard side of the monocoque, Ferrari, which, had in the previous year, it appears that both Alpine and Mercedes have now added an extension to the side pod inlet for the intake to go a bit inboard. And what might that be doing? In my mind, I think that what they're trying to do is eliminate some of the dead zone that occurs right in this junction between where the driver sits, which is called the monocoque, and where the side pod now starts to protrude. These junctions can become incredibly lossy and sort of difficult to manage. And if it does become lossy, then it becomes inconsistent as well. So in an effort to try to find consistency, I think what they're trying to do is sort of bleed off some of that areas of inconsistency and sort of pull it into the intake. This is why they have this P-shaped design. But most of all, the coolest thing, and the other thing is they've gotten rid of this. What did you call it? You called the shotguns or the cannon tips or?
The gun barrels.
The gun barrels. I like that better because I've been calling it like the shoulders or the gully shoulders, which just doesn't. That's not as cool as the gun barrels. I like that. It's very Western. I'm from Texas, so I mean that's kind of right up my alley. So it's called the gun barrels. So Mercedes has gotten rid of the gun barrels, so they're gone, and Red Bull now has them. So that's kind of a funny thing. Yeah, it's a bit crazy, but Mercedes has gone away with that, and we, push rod rear. We can't really see a lot of the details because, granted, teams are being very good about hiding those things. But the thing that was the biggest talking point was the Mercedes front wing. Now, on the Mercedes front wing, what they've done is that you've got 4 elements on a wing. That's the maximum that you can have. The very first element is the one that's closest to the ground and furthest forward. And then it starts to kind of cascade up. You have then the second wing element, the third wing element, and the fourth wing. And the fourth wing element is usually the most almost close to vertical in angle, right? So it's sort of the angles are increasing as you go up. Now on that fourth element, right where you have the flap adjusters, you remember last year everybody was talking about flexi wings, and we were all watching videos of whose flap is moving down more than others, right? Just completely stupid, but anyway. So right where that intersection point is on the other side, so where it flexes on the other side towards the nose, it doesn't flex as much. That was never a question about flexi wings and things. Mercedes has effectively almost chopped that portion of the wing off. Now, they can't completely chop it off because that would be illegal. So what they've done is they've maintained a very small piece of wing, little bit of carbon, which runs down along the length, the top side of the third element, all the way to the nose. So what that does is that satisfies the regulation that says that your wing element needs to connect to the nose, which is why you can't chop it off. And they've also had to make sure that that fourth element can be seen from underneath. So that's also part of the regulation set. It can be seen from above, which we can see, but it can also be seen from underneath. Now, why would they want to do that? The reason is that a few years ago, before this latest regulation set, we had something called a Y250 vortex, where the third element, the fourth element of the wings were essentially they like fell off. They were just completely pointed down and they just stopped. And what that would do is that would allow the teams to generate some vorticity on the front wing. So let me back up. The front wing itself on the top, the side that you can see from above, has a lot of pressure on it. Okay, so it's got a lot of air pressure on it. On the underside, just like a wing that you fly on an airplane, the air is following the curvature of the wing, and as it follows that curvature in something called the Coanda effect, the pressure reduces. So now you've got high pressure on the top, low pressure on the bottom. This is how you generate downforce, right? Because it's kind of sucking the car down to the ground. And if you take two elements where you've got high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other side, and you don't create like a barrier, then what's going to happen is that air is going to go, hey, it's really hard for me to go up this side over here because there's a lot of pressure and I don't really like pressure. So I'm going to go chase the low pressure side because it's much easier for me to move when I go that way. So what happens is the air rolls over from the high pressure side to the low pressure side. And as it rolls over, literally, when you move your finger like this, it rolls and it rolls and it rolls and it creates a vortex. And that's how a vortex is formed. And so that vortex is just then carried around the inside of the tire and it goes along the side of the side pod. And the importance of the Y250 vortex was that it helped you to manage the front tire wake, which meant that you didn't need to worry as much about the front tire wake contacting your side pod or being ingested into your floor. So that's one good thing, right? So you can now start to make your side pod a bit smaller and slimmer, which is less drag. And so now what Mercedes effectively done is kind of revived that a little bit. Now it's not going to be as strong as the Y250 just because the regulation set really doesn't allow you to do that. But even having one single element spooling up some vorticity like they're going to do, and it appears to be 100% illegal. If anybody's saying, or sorry, legal. Sorry, everyone. Mercedes fans, don't attack me. It is 100% legal. Okay, and if anybody says it is illegal, then they don't know the regulation said. So it looks all good, and kudos to Mercedes, man. They've been innovating from the start, and this is just another example. I like it.
I like the sound of it too, Dr. Obbs, and I'm hoping that it can give George and Lewis the set of wheels that they need to challenge a Max Verstappen, but who knows, eh? This is all we'll see once we get probably not even to testing, right? The bloody Friday is going to be in qualies. Is the first time we'll know in earnest whether these things are working or not, as the case may be. Let's talk to Ferrari very quickly as we round third base, Dr. Oz, because you've been super generous with your time. I can't, you touched on it earlier, the pull rod at the back, and again, me with my very noddy understanding of these things, I don't get how it can be important to you as a team to translate your evident qualifying pace to race pace, and then you say that you test the push rod at the back and then decide against it because there wasn't sufficient upside. How? Let me ask the question this way, Dr. Obbs. On the Ferrari car, how do you see anything ostensibly it looks like they might have done to address the difficult problem that it was translating quali to race pace? Or is that, am I asking you a very difficult question, borderline impossible?
That's a really difficult question, Cameron. I think I've been trying to understand all of last year what the issue was with Ferrari and why that was the case. I think one thing that at the start of the year that was sort of a bit evident, but it seemed to kind of go away as the year went on, was just the tire degradation problems they had. I mean, that is always going to be a killer because I think one thing that maybe just a casual race fan, and it doesn't matter if it's IndyCar or Endurance Series or Formula One, that they don't necessarily understand is that these drivers are not going flat out every lap during a race, right? They just can't. They simply can't. The tires will not survive. So what they have to do is they have to manage their tires and they have to manage their pace, which is why the single lap pace on a quali is always much faster than typically the race pace laps that you get, right? They're quite different. So it seems to me like over a single lap that Ferrari was able to maximize their pace, which means that, throwing caution to the wind for tire degradation, they were fast on merit. But once they got to a race, they were not able to maintain that same performance because simply the tires just would not hang on. And it could have been other things too, right? We talk about tires because that's mostly the thing that the drivers will complain about is the tires going off. There can be other things as well, like engine cooling. I think people have sort of wondered if Ferrari was having to kind of turn the engines down a little bit. I think, we had the performance in Monza, which was quite good for them. It suited their car really well. But then there was some rumors, well, they turned the engines up for Monza, right? Because they weren't as worried about it. Who knows? Honestly, who knows where the truth lies with that? I could guess, but I would probably be wrong. So when I look at what Ferrari is doing this year, I think what I am most happy to see is that they finally actually committed to this downwashing design of the side pod. So famously, Ferrari in 2022 came out with whatever you want to call it, the bathtub side pod, the pasta bowl. I've heard so many different things, but it was very unique. And even last year, as they sort of changed the principle of the car, they still maintained a little bit of like a pasta bowl on the inside of the car or a bathtub inboard, and then they had sort of a downwash on the outside. So I called that kind of like a hybrid side pod. And I just couldn't understand why they did that because it didn't make sense to me. Maybe it was because there was other things going on with the chassis and stuff that they couldn't optimize the value of the downwashing principle. Now it seems like they have now, and not only that, they've adopted the water slides. They also have water slides in the car, so they've got a proper downwashing side pod now. So side pods are not everything, by the way. We talk about it because we can see it with our eyes. There's a lot of other things that are very important and more important that go on underneath the floor that you simply cannot see. So I can't speak on whether or not they're missing a trick maybe on the floor side because I can't see it well enough. But what I can see, at least from the top side, is that they've now committed to changing an aerodynamic philosophy to be more along the lines of what others are doing. And as you say, Cameron, with kind of the rear, push rod or no, pull rod, right? So with the rear pull rod suspension, at least in my mind, they're missing a trick there, but they're not dumb. I mean, like they've run the numbers, and if it doesn't work better for them, then they're not doing it. So there must be other things that are going on.
Fair. Here's hoping, man. I desperately want to see Ferrari, all of the top teams up there competing, right? The more the merrier. Speaking to that, Dr. Obbs, McLaren have been a bit cloaks and daggery about their whole livery launch. You couldn't see a lot of anything, not dissimilar to Red Bull, right? Very, very secretive. Red Bull, by the way, had loads of people around the back of their car, so nobody sees the proper interesting stuff just yet, which again, super interesting.
Which makes me really excited to think that there's something cool going on.
Dr. Obbs, I want to know. I want to see it. Not that I don't understand it, but I want to see it and I want to know. Similar thing to McLaren, that we didn't see hardly any of the floor at all, right? Dr. Obbs, what are you hearing through your contacts around McLaren's workings? What have they done with that floor, if you know anything?
I mean, McLaren's progress, I think, over the course of the previous year has been exceptional. I mean, as we all know, they now have their own wind tunnels. So they've been talking about the value that has brought to them. There's a lot of advantages to having that because you're not having to share the wind tunnel with anyone else. So then everybody has the same amount of time that they can do, aerodynamic testing, right? It's part of the regulation set. But something that I see with the McLaren that's quite unique this year is actually not even in the floor. And what we saw in the renders and everything is just not real. I mean, there's a lot of shadowing, there's a lot of blanking off and stuff that's going on there. So they've done something that they're protecting. Now, what we have seen in some of the shakedown images and things there's not really a lot of shakedown stuff that came from the McLaren run, but we did get a glimpse of a cool little wing that they have on the front of their side pod. And I think for most of the listeners, viewers who are familiar with the Mercedes, you'll remember that on the W13 they had what was called the SIS wing, and it was right in front of the side pod. It was a little downwashing wing right there where they had the side impact structure. And it appears that McLaren has something sort of like that. Now, it's not as thick as the Mercedes SIS wing, because the reason that Mercedes had to be so thick is because it had a SIS inside of it. And as long as you don't have the SIS inside there and you move it a bit back into the side pod, you can now make that wing as thin as you want it to be, okay? So it looks like they have that, which to me is really cool when I see that. Now, the first time I saw the Bigfoot photo, grainy shots of the RB20 on track, we all like first saw that overbite. We're like, oh my gosh, they have a wing there. They could still have a wing. I mean, what we saw from the launch was that they have an overbite, but maybe it's a wing. But McLaren has a proper wing from what I can see. And that is a really cool change because for them, that's also an aerodynamic change from an underbite to an overbite. So they've made that switch. So that's now two teams in Red Bull and McLaren who have seen gains in switching to an overbite concept, which there must be something there. So they're definitely cooking on that side because I think they showed their quality last year when they came through and they upgraded their car and it was just bang on faster from day one, which tells me you understand your car, which is the most important thing, Cameron. I mean, like we talk about wings, we talk about water slides and all this stuff, but it doesn't make a lick of difference. And that's my Texas coming out. It doesn't make a lick of difference unless you understand your car. This was Mercedes, in my opinion, problem in 2022 was that they did not understand the car. They did not have good correlation. How can you design anything when you don't understand how everything's working together? McLaren seems to understand their car. They've developed it, they've upgraded it to where now it's a competitive car. They had a few tracks where they fell off, tried to understand why that happened. But generally speaking, they were up there or thereabouts, for podium positions and all those, places during the year. So I'm not sure what's going on the floor though, Cameron. So I haven't seen it. So we'll wait for somebody to bin it during testing and then we'll get a good photo.
Unfortunately,
But
Dr. Obbs, Checo Perez doesn't drive a McLaren, so you might be holding your breath a little while for that.
And even though I'm a Red Bull fan, I mean, like I'm a tech fan first, and so like when that Monaco weekend happened and everybody was binning it, we got to see floors. I was like going out of my mind. I was just like, this is awesome. Like my wife didn't really understand. She was just kind of like, why are you like so excited? Like what's happening? I'm like, people are crashing and there's like nobody's hurt, but they're lifting the cars like way up in the air and everybody's getting to see the floors. And she's like, I don't get it. I don't. So, but yeah.
Which makes me laugh so much, Dr. Obbs, when you see Checo taking a selfie at the reveal and he reveals the vertical. He's just a revealer, isn't he? He's an op. He's Checo. He wants to share the technological and aerodynamic wealth with the rest of the teams. He's desperate to. I'll never forget, actually, Dr. Obbs, that weekend at Monaco last year when he crashed and then we saw it just looked, but again, to another aerodynamic mind who doesn't understand anything, a wing from a bloody Venturi ton. That just looked bonkers. And then you compare and contrast to the flat Williams. You're like, okay, so Red Bull truly are operating